When we think of war games, we often picture storming Normandy, clearing urban combat zones, or using night vision goggles to infiltrate enemy lines. These iconic moments dominate the genre, constant action and fast-paced movement. But what about the war that came before all that? World War I, largely considered the first modern war, introduced tanks, machine guns, chemical weapons, and trench warfare, and yet still one of the least explored conflicts in gaming. There are no endless rows of World War I titles lining store shelves or topping Steam charts. In fact, only one game has ever brought it to the mainstream, and even that one had to bend the truth just to make it fun. In this video, I will be breaking down why World War I is one of the hardest wars to turn into a compelling shooter. So why does the Great War make for a not so great game? To understand why World War I struggles to be adapted into video games, we need to understand what made it so different from other wars. World War I wasn't just about fast-moving front lines and heroic special forces missions. It was a war of attrition. It introduced trench warfare, where soldiers spent months in muddy, rat-infested trenches, waiting for orders to charge across no man's land, usually straight into machine gun fire. The war was slow, brutal, and unforgiving, and the combat reflected that. Instead of urban shootouts or daring assaults, World War I battles were long, drawn-out slogs that left millions dead for only a few feet of land. Weapons were clunky and slow. Soldiers primarily used bolt-action rifles with only a handful of early machine guns, flamethrowers, and primitive tanks. Artillery was the real killer. Not gunfights, not bayonet charges, but endless shelling that buried men alive in mud. So how do you turn that into a fun video game? Well, that's the problem. When people think of World War I, they usually think of trench warfare, which is iconic due to the idea of massive human waves going over the top and charging into the opposing trench. But just imagine, you are playing a World War I shooter. You get that whistle, you climb over the top. Hundreds of soldiers are following you, screaming the battle cries, just for you to realize that the enemy trench is filled with head glitchers. While iconic, trench warfare doesn't transfer over to games very well. It slows down gameplay and prioritizes a more defensive playstyle. Unlike the dynamic, ever-shifting battlefronts of World War II or more modern wars, World War I's front lines were mostly static. Soldiers spent weeks or even months in the same trenches, waiting for the next attack. This creates a gameplay loop where players would either be sitting in a defensive position for long stretches of time, or charging across no man's land, where they'd likely get mowed down by machine guns. That kind of stop and start pacing isn't ideal for a shooter, where movement and engagement variety are key to keeping players entertained. Second, trench combat is repetitive and lacks flexibility. Most battles revolved around a simple pattern: bombard the enemy, send soldiers over the top, and hope they survive long enough to reach the next trench. There was little room for flanking, maneuvering, or tactical positioning. Combat was mostly head-on. In a video game, this could lead to frustrating one-sided engagements, where attackers feel helpless and defenders feel stuck in place. This repetitiveness only gets exacerbated when paired with the limited weapon variety that World War I had. While the early use of machine guns is notable in the war, they were mostly used in static defensive positions rather than assaulting. Most infantrymen would carry bolt-action rifles, which were slow, which in video games makes combat more methodical. You can't run and gun while you're stuck cycling a bolt-action rifle after every shot. In order to counter this, developers would have to make a game extremely unrealistic for entertainment, or go fully into hardcore realism, which is an extremely niche market. See, this is a huge issue, not just with World War I shooters, but with realistic shooters as a whole. It's extremely difficult to balance historical accuracy and fun. Realistic World War I combat doesn't fit traditional FPS mechanics. Gunfights would involve slow, methodical shooting rather than run and gun action. If the game sticks too closely to realism, it risks feeling sluggish and outdated compared to other shooters on the market. Another issue is the sheer brutality of World War I. Unlike World War II, which is often portrayed as a battle between good and evil, World War I was a war of attrition, where soldiers were sent to die in senseless charges, suffocated by gas, or buried alive by artillery strikes. A truly accurate World War I game would likely be depressing and frustrating, with players being randomly killed by artillery they never saw coming or suffering from gas attacks. If the game toned down these elements for playability, it wouldn't fully capture the horror of the war, but if it leaned too far into realism, it could be too punishing for most players. Which in all honesty, I think is kinda lame, because the whole purpose of these games to be realistic is for players to experience what they hopefully never will, and to gain an understanding and respect for those who went in harm's way. Ultimately, a World War I shooter has to walk a fine line. Too much realism and it becomes slow, frustrating, and niche. Too much fun and fast-paced action and it stops feeling like World War I altogether. That balancing act is one of the reasons why so few developers attempt a World War I setting. It's incredibly difficult to make a game that's both engaging and respectful to the reality of war. One game, or I guess series of games, which took on this challenge of an authentic World War I game is Verdun, Tannenberg, and Isonzo. These games attempted at doing what other developers wouldn't dare, and while these games did a great job at authentically making a World War I shooter, they weren't very successful, with none of the three games ever getting many players at one time. Verdun was set in the Western Front, obviously because of the name, and most of the fighting was almost entirely done in trenches, thus making Verdun succumb to the issues I mentioned with trench warfare based games. Then Tannenberg came around, being set in the Eastern Front, which was more fluid than the Western Front, but it still had involved trenches, just not as developed as those in the West. This reflects in Tannenberg because while there are trenches, the maps are more maneuverable and are less restricted than if they were just rows of trenches. Finally, we got Isonzo, which was set around the Italian front. The front was on the eastern side of the Alps, which created some of the most unique battles of World War I. Unlike the very unchanging scenes of the Western Front, the Italian front had unique mountainous terrain which allowed for intense long-range engagements. There were also tunnels which were dug into these mountains, so close-quarters combat was also common. Isonzo seemed to not struggle with the slowness that trench warfare has in video games. While it has the best player count of the three, it still never broke 6,000 players. Regardless of how interesting and unique the maps and terrain is, the slowness of the weapons and combat always prevents a modern audience to support a World War I game. And with the average player just wanting instant gratification, they are just more likely to turn to more fast-paced video games. And that's why World War I shooters struggle to keep a player base.
Well, actually, Battlefield 1 is a World War I shooter which saw millions of people play it.
Well, while Battlefield 1 is a great war game, it isn't really a great war game. It feels more like a World War II game just using World War I assets. Battlefield 1 was known for being one of the most immersive first-person shooters out there, and it's still an amazing game. It's just that none of the gameplay mechanics actually mirror the reality of World War I. While the game looks extremely realistic and immersive at times, the game takes an extreme amount of liberties with historical accuracy to make the gameplay more catered to a modern audience. And that's why it was, and still is, so popular. Compared to the small handful of other World War I shooters, this is the only one which was able to get hundreds of thousands of players at once. Even to this day, it has a larger concurrent player base on Steam than games like Isonzo or Verdun ever had. It just goes to show, no matter the setting, if you want your game to succeed, you must pander to the modern audience, which requires constant action and fast-paced gameplay. But there's still a dedicated audience that wants to play a World War I game. The problem is that no realistic Great War shooter has ever found widespread success, except for Battlefield 1, which, as I've said, wasn't exactly realistic. So that raises the question, who would even dare try and make a truly authentic World War I game today? Well, there's one game that's stepping up, Over the Top by Flying Squirrel Entertainment. Over the Top is an upcoming World War I shooter that's aiming to do what no other game has quite pulled off, making realism and fun coexist. It promises massive 200-player battles, tanks, airstrikes, and yes, even an impressive selection of mustaches. But the feature that really stands out to me is explosive landscaping, a system where artillery, tanks, and explosives can physically reshape the battlefield. That means you can create your own cover, carve out new paths, or dig in as the terrain constantly evolves, turning the static nature of trench warfare into something that's much more dynamic. It's also not just another Western Front simulator. The game's environment appears to be more varied, featuring different types of terrain and combat scenarios that go beyond the stereotypical mud-filled trenches. And from that early gameplay footage, it looks like Over the Top is trying to strike that perfect balance. Gritty and realistic, but with just enough fluidity and chaos to keep things engaging. Still, the question remains, will it actually succeed? Can it avoid the fate of Verdun, Tannenberg, and Isonzo, or will it fall in the same trap of being too slow and punishing for a modern audience? That's something we'll have to wait and see. The game is set to release in 2025 with multiple playtests prior, so if you are interested, go check it out. The Great War might just be gaming's greatest challenge. It's a conflict defined by chaos, suffering, and slow, brutal combat. A far cry from the fast-paced action modern players crave. Battlefield 1 bent the truth to deliver a thrilling experience, while games like Verdun and Tannenberg stuck to realism and got buried in the niche. The truth is, World War I doesn't fit neatly into the mold of a typical shooter. It demands a different approach, one that respects the history, the horror, and the humanity, while still delivering an experience people actually want to play. Maybe with innovation, persistence, and a little bit of risk, we'll eventually get the game that captures the true essence of the Great War, without sacrificing what makes games fun. But until then, World War I remains a difficult war to make into a game. But what do you think? Should more developers take a risk and bring World War I to life in new ways? Or is the Great War just too grim and slow for modern gaming? Will Over the Top be successful, or end up like the rest of these kinds of games? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, drop a like, consider subscribing, and check out my other video on why the Korean War gets ignored in gaming. Thanks for watching.